2 women were trapped above McCoy Falls as night swallowed the canyon. A Navy SEAL followed one wrong trail and vanished beneath the pines. Then an FBI agent's German Shepherd stopped cold, staring into the dark like he heard a prayer no human could hear. What Bishop found below the roots changed everything. If you believe God still sends help to the forgotten, leave amen.
By late afternoon, McCoy Canyon looked too beautiful to be dangerous. Sunlight poured over the sandstone walls in long golden sheets, touching the pine tops, the mossy stones, and the thin white ribbons of water that slipped down the cliffs like loose silk. In the North Cascades of Washington, beauty often wore a quiet face. It did not shout. It simply waited, still and shining, until someone trusted it too much. Special Agent Alara Quinn had learned not to trust silence too quickly. At 30, she carried herself with the lean steadiness of someone who had spent years walking into rooms where people stopped speaking the moment she entered. She was tall and slim, with a strong, athletic frame shaped more by discipline than display. Her dark brown hair was tied low at the back of her neck, neat enough for duty, loose enough to suggest she had been in the field since dawn. Her skin was fair from long northern winters, and her gray-green eyes had the sharp, searching look of a woman who rarely accepted the first version of any story. She wore a dark navy FBI field jacket, black tactical pants, weatherproof boots, and thin gloves already stained with pine dust. People sometimes mistook her quietness for coldness. That was their mistake. Alara felt too much, which was why she had trained herself to show very little. Years earlier, during a mountain search in Idaho, a call for help had reached the wrong desk, then the wrong unit, then no one fast enough. The person had not come home. Since then, every delayed radio signal felt to Alara like a hand closing around her ribs. Beside her stood Bishop, her K-9 partner, a 5-year, old working-line German Shepherd with a large muscular build and a sable coat marked by a dark saddle across his back and golden-brown highlights along his neck and flanks. His ears stood alert, his amber eyes calm but ancient-looking, as if he had been born knowing that humans often needed guidance long before they admitted it. Bishop was not an excitable dog. He saved his energy for things that mattered. When he moved with purpose. When he stopped, Alara listened. They had come to Silverpine, Washington, for what the local reports politely called a pattern of trail safety irregularities. Alara hated phrases like that. Too clean, too smooth. Over the past 8 months, hikers had taken wrong turns on familiar paths, old warning signs had gone missing, trail maps had updated strangely, and rescue requests had been delayed through layers of harmless-looking paperwork. No single incident proved anything. Together, they formed a shadow. That evening, the shadow finally moved. Margaret Ellis, 67, and her younger sister, Linda Carver, 61, had entered McCoy Canyon just after noon. Margaret was a narrow-shouldered woman with soft white curls tucked beneath a faded blue hiking cap, pale skin freckled by age, and the careful smile of someone who had learned to keep sorrow folded neatly where strangers could not see it. Her husband had passed away 2 years earlier, and McCoy Canyon had been a place they once promised to visit together. Linda, shorter and rounder, with sandy gray hair, rosy cheeks, and a practical red windbreaker, had agreed to come because she loved her sister more than she trusted the trail. By sunset, they were trapped on a narrow ledge near the falls. They had followed a sign that should have led back toward the main path. Instead, it had guided them into a steep side route where the rocks grew slick, the brush thickened, and the sound of falling water swallowed every ordinary sense of direction. When the light dropped behind the canyon wall, the world changed quickly. The warm gold disappeared. The shadows rose. The 2 women did the wisest thing frightened people can do in wild country. They stopped moving and called for help. Silverpine Search and Rescue reached the trailhead under a violet sky. Ruth Calloway stepped out of the command truck with a clipboard in one hand and a headlamp already strapped over her short silver hair. She was 62, small in stature, lean as an old fence rail, with a deeply lined face, pale blue eyes, and a voice that never wasted force. Ruth had led rescues through snow, floodwater, loose shale, and nights so cold they seemed to have teeth. People in Silver Pine said she had become part of the mountains after losing her son in a climbing accident many years before. Ruth never corrected them. She simply kept showing up when the mountains called someone else's child into trouble. 2 subjects on a ledge near the lower falls, Ruth said, pointing to the map spread across the hood of the truck. Cold, scared, but responsive. We go slow. Nobody becomes the 3rd rescue tonight. Connor Vale stood near the rope team, tightening a harness with practiced hands. He was 33, a Navy SEAL on recovery leave, though nothing about him looked idle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered in the way of men who had spent much of their adult lives outdoors and under pressure. His dark blonde hair was cut short, his jaw shaded with a close-trimmed beard, and his blue-gray eyes moved over the canyon with quiet calculation. His father had once served as a wildland firefighter in these mountains, and Connor had returned to Silver Pine after years away, partly to rest and partly because some places call a man back before he understands why. He was not officially in charge of anything. That suited him. He served as a volunteer rope technician, steady, capable, and polite in the understated way of someone who did not need to prove himself to every room he entered. The search team split at the old cedar marker. Ruth sent one group toward the waterfall approach and another along the ridgeline. Alara and Bishop moved with the first team, tracking the scent trail Margaret and Linda had left behind. Wool, worry, crushed fern, the faint sweetness of orange candy. One of them had carried in a jacket pocket. For nearly half a mile, Bishop worked smoothly. Then, near a cluster of fallen branches, his body changed. A sharp crack snapped through the trees, not loud, not close, but wrong. Bishop froze so suddenly that the leash went still in Alara's hand. His ears pointed toward a darker side trail, and in the pause that followed, even the waterfall seemed to hold its breath. Alara lowered her eyes to the ground. A thin strip of orange trail ribbon hung from a branch, but it had been tied in the wrong direction. Freshly broken twigs marked a narrow path leading away from the main route. Near the roots of a hemlock there was a smear of red clay that did not match the damp brown soil around it. Connor saw it too. He crouched, touched the clay with 2 fingers, and looked toward the side trail. "This does not belong here." Ruth's voice came over the radio, asking for status. Connor keyed his mic. "Vale here. I have a possible marker displacement near the lower approach. I am checking 30 yards ahead, then returning to the main line." "Keep it tight," Ruth replied. "Copy." He moved into the brush with the careful confidence of a man who understood risk. Alara watched him disappear between the trees. Something in her wanted to tell him to wait. Something older and more disciplined told her not to command another professional without cause. The radio hissed once, then again. Then Connor's signal broke into static and vanished. Ruth tried to reach him twice. No answer. The main rescue could not stop. Margaret and Linda were still calling from the ledge, and the temperature was falling fast. Ruth's face tightened, but she did not panic. Panic had no rank in her command. Alara turned to Bishop. He was no longer facing the women's scent trail. His nose worked the air in short, urgent pulls, his eyes fixed on the side path where Connor had gone. "Bishop," Alara said softly, "show me." The shepherd moved. Alara radioed Ruth before following. "Quinn taking K9 down the side trail. Possible secondary subject. I will mark position every 2 minutes." "Understood," Ruth said. "Do not vanish on me, Agent." Alara almost smiled. No intention. The trail narrowed quickly. Ferns brushed her knees. Damp stone shifted under her boots. Bishop pulled, but did not rush, following something carried on the cold air: sweat, crushed brush, metal, fear, and a bitter scent Alara could not name. The canyon seemed to close around them, the walls rising like old guardians who had seen too much and explained too little. Then Bishop stopped beside a split cedar root. At first, Alara saw only darkness under the brush. Then a hand moved weakly against the soil. Connor Vale lay half-sheltered beneath the roots, one shoulder pressed into the stones, his face pale beneath the dirt, his breathing shallow. His right leg was swollen near the boot line, marked by the unmistakable signs of a rattlesnake bite. One hand clutched a cracked mini trail camera, its casing broken, its memory card still inside. Alara dropped to one knee. "Connor, stay with me." His eyes opened only halfway. Recognition flickered, fragile as a candle in wind. Bishop lowered himself beside Connor's chest, pressing warmth against him with a gentleness that seemed almost human. Connor's lips moved. Alara leaned closer. "Someone," he whispered, each word barely making it past the cold. Someone moved the trail. Above them, the waterfall thundered into the dark. Alara reached for her radio and called for urgent medical support, while Bishop rested his great head close to Connor's heart, as if keeping time for a man the canyon had not yet claimed. Is less than break time equals 0, and 5S is greater than. Alara Quinn dropped to one knee beside Connor Vale as the canyon breathed cold air around them. The waterfall below kept roaring in the dark, a steady white thunder that made every radio call feel smaller than it should have been. Connor lay half-curled beneath the cedar roots, his broad frame trapped between damp stone and twisted brush. One hand still locked around the broken trail camera, as if his body had understood the importance of evidence even after his strength had begun to fade. His face had gone pale beneath dirt and sweat, his jaw tight under the short beard, his blue-gray eyes opening and closing like a man fighting the pull of deep water. Alara pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, felt the weak but steady beat, and let herself breathe once before duty returned like iron in her spine. "Connor, stay with me," she said, her voice low and even. "Rescue team is coming. You are not alone down here." Bishop lay close against Connor's chest, the large German Shepherd's sable coat catching a faint silver edge from Alara's headlamp. His amber eyes did not soften, exactly. Bishop was not a creature of decoration, but he lowered his head near Connor's shoulder with a gentleness that felt almost ceremonial, as if the dog had chosen to lend the fallen man some of his own steady life. Alara checked Connor's leg without disturbing it more than she had to. The swelling near the boot line told her enough. A rattlesnake bite, likely from the warm rock pocket nearby where the last heat of the day still hid under stone. Late spring in the North Cascades could fool people that way. The air turned cold, but the rocks remembered the sun. Connor's lips moved. Alara leaned closer. "I did not leave the team," he whispered, the words broken by pain and cold. "Was coming back. Saw a wire low near the ground. I stepped clear. The slope gave." His eyes fluttered, then fixed with sudden urgency. "Not the women's trail. Someone set that marker wrong." Alara looked up. Above them, the narrow side path disappeared between black hemlocks and wet ferns. She could smell red clay on Connor's sleeve, fresh sap from cut branches, and something faintly chemical like waterproofing spray on outdoor equipment. Not enough to name. Enough to remember. Ruth Calloway's voice cracked through the radio. "Quinn, status," Alara answered without looking away from Connor. "Secondary subject located. Connor Vale is alive. Possible rattlesnake bite. Fall trauma. Exposure. Need rope team and medical extraction at my beacon." There was a pause, but only a heartbeat's worth. Ruth was not a woman who wasted fear. "Copy. Team 2 to Quinn's marker. Team 1 remains on the ledge rescue. Nobody rushes. Everybody comes home." In that moment, Alara understood why people followed Ruth into places no sensible person would enter after dark. The older woman's calm did not erase danger. It gave danger a boundary. A sudden beam of white light swept across the canyon wall above them, then vanished. Bishop lifted his head so fast his ears cut sharp shadows across Connor's jacket. For one long second, the only sound was water and breath. Then a pebble clicked down the slope, bounced once near Alara's boot, and disappeared into the dark. Alara turned off her headlamp for 3 seconds and listened. No voice, no movement. Just the ancient pulse of the falls and Bishop's low, restrained warning in the back of his throat. When she switched the light back on, Connor was watching her through half-open eyes. "Someone was up there," he breathed. Alara did not answer. She did not need to. She slid the broken camera into an evidence pouch, then placed her gloved hand on Connor's shoulder. "First we get you out, then we ask the canyon what it saw." The rope team arrived in pieces of light, helmets bobbing through the brush, carabiners chiming softly, boots finding holds on stone made slick by mist. 2 paramedic volunteers came with them. One was a young man named Caleb Rusk, broad-faced and red-haired, with the anxious kindness of someone still new enough to feel every rescue personally. The other, Denise Morrow, was a compact woman in her 40s with dark skin, calm hands, and the practical eyes of someone who had learned that panic was never useful but compassion always was. Denise took one look at Connor's leg, then at his fading focus, and gave crisp instructions that everyone obeyed. Anti-venom would have to wait for the hospital, but stabilization could begin here. Getting Connor out was slow work. Nothing glamorous lived in that hour. It was rope, mud, breath, clipped commands, and the deep discipline of strangers refusing to let the canyon keep a man who had come to help others. Bishop stayed close until Ruth ordered Alara to move with the haul line. The dog resisted only once, glancing back at Connor with a low sound in his chest, then obeyed when Alara touched his collar. Trust, she had learned, was not always soft. Sometimes it was a working animal choosing obedience when every instinct wanted to stay beside the wounded. By the time Connor reached the upper trail, the eastern edge of the sky had begun to pale. Farther down the canyon, Margaret Ellis and Linda Carver were brought off the ledge in harnesses, trembling, exhausted, but alive. Margaret's white curls had escaped her cap and clung damply to her forehead. Linda held her sister's hand so tightly their knuckles looked like small stones pressed together. When Ruth told them they were safe, Margaret closed her eyes, and for a moment her face became not old or afraid, but young with gratitude. "My husband always said the canyon had a voice," she whispered. "Tonight it sounded like all of you." Connor was transported to St. Alder Medical Center, a low regional hospital with pale brick walls, bright windows, and a lobby that smelled of coffee, disinfectant, and rain-soaked coats. Doctors treated the rattlesnake bite and monitored the effects of the fall. Ilara remained near the emergency wing, the evidence pouch never far from her hand. Bishop sat at her left side, still as a carved guardian, though his eyes tracked every passing shoe. That was where Victor Sloan first appeared. He entered as if the hallway had been arranged for him. Victor was in his late 40s, tall and trim, with dark hair brushed back from a thoughtful forehead and just enough silver at the temples to make age look like authority. His charcoal coat fit perfectly. His smile was warm in shape, but not in temperature. He introduced himself as the principal donor behind the McCoy Canyon Safety Renewal Initiative, speaking in a soft, polished voice about community, rescue infrastructure, and the tragedy that had nearly unfolded. He seemed concerned. He seemed generous. Elara had met enough dangerous men to know that generosity could be worn like perfume. "I only want to make sure the families are cared for," Victor said, his gaze drifting for half a second to the sealed evidence pouch in Alara's hand. Bishop rose before Alara moved. The German shepherd stepped in front of her, shoulders squared, amber eyes fixed on Victor, and released one low growl that made the hallway feel suddenly narrow. Victor paused, then gave a small, amused smile. "Protective fellow." Ilara did not smile back, observant. A few minutes later, a legal assistant tied to Victor's office approached Margaret and Linda with a clipboard and a neat stack of forms. His name was Alan Pierce, a narrow man in his mid-30s with sandy hair, pale eyelashes, and a manner so politely nervous it felt rehearsed. He wore clean clothes, but Bishop lowered his nose toward the man's shoes and stiffened. Red clay marked the edge of one sole, nearly hidden beneath the rubber. The same clay from the side trail. Alan explained the forms as routine privacy protection, meant to prevent media confusion. Ilara stepped between him and the women before Margaret could take the pen. "No signatures tonight," she said. "Not without independent counsel or family present." Alan blinked too quickly. "Of course, I meant no pressure." "Then you will not mind leaving your card." He did, with fingers that trembled just enough to be honest about fear, though not honest about its source. Near dawn, Ilara finally accessed the memory card from Connor's broken camera. The footage was fragmented, rain-specked, and dark. A black SUV passed near the old trail entrance. A gloved hand removed a weathered warning sign. A figure in an outdoor work jacket turned briefly toward the lens. Ilara froze the frame and enlarged it. The image blurred, then sharpened by a breath. On the jacket was a faint logo, Northline Terrain Services. Not proof. Not yet. But the first stone had shifted, and somewhere beneath it, something hidden had begun to move. Is less than break time equals 0. 5S is greater than. By mid-morning, Silver Pine Ranger Station looked less like the heart of a mountain district and more like a place that had been asked to survive on good intentions and outdated equipment. The building sat beneath tall firs at the edge of town, its green paint faded by rain, its porch boards bowed slightly in the middle, its flag snapping in a clean northern wind. Inside, the air smelled of paper, coffee, boot rubber, and wet cedar. Maps covered nearly every wall. Some were new and glossy, printed from digital systems. Others were old enough to have soft corners and pencil marks from hands that had known the canyon before software decided it could understand a mountain. Ilara Quinn stood before the largest map of McCoy Canyon with Bishop at her side. The K-9 had slept little after the rescue, but he remained steady, ears alert, amber eyes following the room with that grave patience Ilara had come to trust more than many human explanations. The broken trail camera from Connor Vale's hand had given them only pieces. A black SUV, a gloved hand removing a sign, a blurred jacket with the Northline Terrain Services logo, not enough to accuse. Enough to stop pretending the canyon had simply made a mistake. The woman waiting for Ilara near the records desk introduced herself as Maren Holt. She was 29, slender and slightly stooped, as if years of apologizing had shaped her posture before age could. Her hair was a soft brown cut just below the chin, tucked nervously behind one ear, and her skin held the pale indoor tone of someone who spent more time with maps and permits than with sunlight. She wore a forest green ranger fleece, khaki field pants, and scuffed boots that looked newer than she wanted them to. Maren's eyes were dark and intelligent, but they moved too quickly, always checking doors, windows, faces, as if trouble could enter from any direction and ask her to sign for it. "I should have noticed sooner," Maren said before Ilara asked anything. Ilara studied her quietly. "Noticed what?" Maren swallowed. "That the little things were lining up." She led Ilara to a side office where the filing cabinets were dented and the computer monitors hummed with tired blue light. Ruth Calloway was already there, standing with both arms folded, her silver hair flattened from a long night under a helmet. The rescue leader looked older in daylight, not weaker, just more human. Her face carried exhaustion in the fine lines around her mouth, but her pale eyes were still sharp enough to cut through excuses. Maren opened a spreadsheet, then a folder of printed incident reports. 8 months, she said. 6 wrong route hiking calls. 4 missing trail signs, 3 delayed maintenance tickets, 2 map updates that removed old hazard notes, 1 warning route dropped from the public navigation layer. She looked at Ruth, then at Ilara. Individually, none of it looked criminal. A storm loosens a sign. A volunteer forgets a work order. A hiker misreads a fork. But together, Ilara said, it becomes a pattern. Ruth let out a slow breath through her nose. Or a mess. Mountain districts are full of mess. Ilara did not argue. She clicked open the video still from Connor's camera and turned the screen toward Ruth. The gloved hand, the sign, the Northline jacket. Ruth looked at it for a long time. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. That silence told Ilara more than a denial would have. Maren pulled another file from her desk. Victor Sloan's foundation started donating equipment last fall. Radios, drone time, rescue rope, trail software, weather beacons. It sounded like a blessing. Her voice thinned. I signed the receiving forms for some of it. You thought you were helping, Ilara said. I thought if we had better tools, Ruth's people would stop having to make miracles out of duct tape and old batteries. Marin gave a small, humorless smile. Turns out miracles have paperwork too. Ruth turned toward her. Marin? The young ranger looked down, ashamed before she had even been accused. Elara recognized that look. Guilt loved decent people because they carried it carefully. No one is charging you with trusting a donor, Elara said. But from here on, we follow every tool, every serial number, every update. From the corner of the room came a sudden metallic clink. Bishop had risen without a sound and placed one heavy paw against a coil of bright rescue rope hanging from a storage rack. His nose brushed the rope once. Then his ears flattened, and a low warning moved through his chest, soft as distant thunder. The room stopped breathing. Ruth stepped closer. That rope came in last month. Elara crouched beside Bishop and lifted the edge of the coil without touching her nose to it. There was a faint scent there, almost hidden beneath nylon and storage dust chemical, waxy, clean in the wrong way. Not poison, not fuel. Something like waterproofing or equipment sealant. She remembered Connor's sleeve, the broken trail camera, the red clay under Alan Pierce's shoe at the hospital. A family of smells, not identical, but related. Bag this, Elara said. Not as proof yet, as a comparison sample. Ruth's face changed then. Not fear, not quite. Grief, perhaps, at having to suspect a gift. Sloan gave us that rope, she said. At a ceremony. Cameras, coffee, little speeches about community safety. Her mouth twisted. I hate speeches. Always have. Before anyone could answer, Elara's phone buzzed. The hospital number. She stepped into the hall and answered. Connor's voice came through rough and tired, scraped thin by medication and pain, but alive. Agent Quinn? I'm here. They said you found the camera. We did. I remembered something. He paused, breathing unevenly. Before I slipped, I caught radio traffic. Not SAR frequency. Higher band, maybe private. A voice said, "Let them find the women, not the old route." Another breath. I thought I heard it wrong. Elara looked through the office window at the wall map of McCoy Canyon, the old route. Did you see where it led? Only part of it. Ferns. A burned cedar. Water on the left, not the right. His voice weakened. My father used to talk about a cut trail. Old fern something. Behind Elara, Maureen turned pale. Old fern cut, she whispered when Elara repeated the phrase. That cannot be right. Ruth looked at her. Why? Marin moved fast then, fear and purpose finally joining hands. She pulled up the current public map. No old fern cut. Then she opened an archived paper scan from 11 years earlier. There it was, a narrow dashed line running along the upper shoulder of the canyon, crossing behind the falls and connecting to an emergency access point. Ruth leaned over the desk, her old eyes sharpening. That route would have put us above Margaret and Linda in half the time, Ruth said. It was removed from the new system 3 months ago, Marin said. Marked unstable. Was it? I do not know. Marin's voice trembled. I never inspected it. The status came through a contracted update. North Line? Elara asked. Marin closed her eyes briefly. Yes. They might have stopped there, with enough unease to carry into the next day, if a small bell had not jingled at the front door. A boy stepped into the ranger station carrying a cardboard tube almost as tall as his leg. He was about 12, thin as a sapling, with copper-brown hair sticking up in honest disobedience, freckles across his nose, and round glasses that slid down whenever he looked at the floor. Marin softened at the sight of him. Eli Brooks, she said. You are supposed to be in school. It is a teacher workday, the boy replied, with the careful dignity of a child used to correcting adults. Mom said I could bring the map if it helps. Eli's mother owned Brooks Outfitters, the small climbing and hiking shop on Main Street. Eli, it turned out, had grown up listening to his grandfather tell stories about McCoy Canyon before the new trail system. He unrolled a hand-drawn map across the table. It was made in colored pencil, full of childish detail and surprising accuracy. The lower falls, the split cedar, the old rescue anchor, the burned stump, and a green line labeled in careful block letters, Old Fern Cut. Bishop walked to the table, sniffed once, then placed one paw gently on the green line. No one laughed. Not even Eli. Marin stared at the dog's paw, then at the old scan on her screen. Something inside her seemed to settle, not into comfort, but into courage. She returned to the archive folders and searched harder, this time not by the trail name but by emergency access numbers. 10 minutes later, she found it. A maintenance report filed 2 years earlier, misplaced in a winter road closure folder. Old Fern Cut had been inspected, reinforced in 2 spots, and listed as usable for emergency rescue access under dry conditions. Then Marin found the replacement report. It was newer, cleaner, shorter. It declared Old Fern Cut unsafe, recommended removal from active rescue maps, and carried the contractor's stamp of Northline Terrain Services. Alara looked from the 2 reports to Eli's map, then to the canyon wall chart where Victor Sloan's proposed private access road cut through public land like a silver knife. The answer rose quietly, terribly, and whole. If Old Fern Cut still existed, Victor did not need a new private road into McCoy Canyon. And if the public knew that, his beautiful safety initiative would begin to look less like a rescue plan and more like a door he was trying to build for himself. Is less than break time equals 0, and 5S is greater than. Morning returned to McCoy Canyon as if nothing terrible had happened there. Light spilled over the high sandstone walls in pale gold, soft at first, then warmer as it touched the pines, the wet ferns, and the silver skin of the falls far below. Mist lifted from the canyon floor in thin white veils. Somewhere above the ridge, a thrush sang one clear note, then another, as though the forest were reminding every frightened human that it had been alive long before their maps, their meetings, and their clever little lies. Alara Quinn stood at the trailhead with Bishop beside her and tried to look at the canyon without anger. It was not easy. In the night, this place had held 2 terrified women on a ledge and nearly kept Connor Vale beneath its roots and stone. Yet under the morning sun, McCoy Canyon looked less like an enemy and more like an old church with its doors left open. The danger had never been the forest itself. The danger was what people had done to it, then blamed on the trees. Ruth Calloway arrived with 3 trusted members of Silver Pine Search and Rescue, all chosen because Ruth believed they knew the difference between gossip and duty. Marin Holt came last, clutching a waterproof folder to her chest as if the papers inside might fly away and accuse her from the sky. The young ranger's face looked pale in daylight, her brown hair tucked behind both ears, her eyes restless but determined. She had barely slept. Guilt had kept better watch over her than coffee ever could. Connor called from St. Alder Medical Center just as they reached the first fork. His voice came through weak but steadier than before. Threaded with the dry humor of a man trying to prove pain, had not been given command. If you reach the cedar with the split trunk, you went too far right, he said. Look for a burned oak. Lightning scar runs down one side. After that there is a rock shaped like an animal's head. My father called it the Old Wolf Stone. Ruth snorted softly. Your father named half this canyon after animals. He was a firefighter, Connor replied. Naming rocks was cheaper than therapy. Even Alara felt the corner of her mouth move. Then Bishop lifted his head, nose testing the breeze, and the small warmth of humor passed. The dog stepped off the current public trail and moved toward a slope layered with pine needles and fern. Alara let the leash out slowly. Bishop was not rushing. That was what made her trust him. Panic pulled. Bishop guided. The slope led to a narrow shoulder of land, almost hidden behind fallen branches. At first glance, it looked like storm debris. But Ruth crouched and pushed aside one limb, then another. The cut ends were too clean. Not fresh from this morning, but not old enough to belong to winter either. Marin swallowed hard and took photographs while Alara marked the GPS point. There, Ruth said. Under a shelf of stone, half covered by leaves, lay an old warning sign. Its metal face was scratched but readable. Emergency access Old Fern Cut, trained personnel only. The bolts had not rusted loose. They had been removed, neatly, patiently, by someone who had brought tools. Marin pressed one hand over her mouth. That sign was listed as weather damaged. Ruth's eyes hardened. Weather has learned to use a wrench then. They followed the hidden path in careful formation. Old fern cut was narrow, but it was not gone. Roots crossed it. Ferns leaned over it. Moss softened the stone edges. Still, the old grade held. In several places, someone years ago had set rock steps into the slope and reinforced the outer edge with timber now darkened by rain. It was not a trail for tourists. But for a trained rescue team in dry conditions, it was usable. More than usable. It offered a safer, high approach to the lower falls, exactly where Margaret and Linda had spent the night waiting in the cold. Alara stopped above the overlook and looked down. From this angle, the story rearranged itself. The main public trail curved away, long and slow. Old fern cut crossed behind the falls and reached an anchor point in half the distance. If Ruth's team had known the route was still viable, they could have reached the women earlier. Connor might never have gone alone down the wrong side path. The canyon had not hidden the way. Someone else had. A faint mechanical hum sliced through the birdsong. Bishop froze, every muscle hard beneath his sable coat. His amber eyes lifted to the bright sky, and for one breath the canyon seemed to tilt around that sound, a small black drone hovering above the ridge like an insect made of glass and suspicion. Alara remembered Bishop's old training file, the mission years ago when a surveillance drone had startled him during a rescue operation and nearly led him into unstable ground. Since then, the sound could tighten him like a drawn bow. But this time, Bishop did not break. He lowered his head, moved into shadow beneath a cedar, and looked back at Alara as if to say, "Not fear, follow." Ruth motioned everyone under cover. The drone drifted once across the treetops, then held position above the hidden trail. It was not searching for lost hikers. It was watching them. Alara used her phone to record it, while Marin whispered the model number through trembling lips. It matched one of the units donated through Victor Sloan's safety initiative, though the active operator ID had been removed from the public broadcast tag. They waited until the drone moved east, then continued. Bishop led them to a cluster of salal bushes near the old wolf stone Connor had described. Beneath the leaves, Alara found a waterproof metal box tucked into a hollow between roots. Ruth opened it with gloved hands. Inside were spare camera batteries, strips of orange trail ribbon, a compact signal transmitter, a folded older rescue map, and a plastic tag bearing the inventory code of Northline Terrain Services. Marin stared at the tag as if it had spoken her name. "I signed for that shipment," she said, her voice nearly gone. "It came through the station as donated maintenance equipment. I thought it was for trail restoration." Her shoulders folded inward, and for a moment she looked younger than 29, like a child waiting for a sentence. Alara stepped closer, but did not soften the truth. "You signed for a box. You did not hide it here. I helped it enter the system, then helped take it out." Alara's voice was quiet, but firm. "A mistake is not the end of your story, Marin. The question is whether you let someone else use your shame as a leash." Marin looked at her then, eyes wet but clearer. She nodded once and began photographing the contents of the box. They moved toward the overlook where the sound of the falls grew heavy. Ruth stood at the edge longer than necessary. Her face changed there. Not dramatically. Ruth was not a woman who displayed sorrow like a flag. But Alara saw the way her fingers closed around the strap of her pack, the way her eyes fixed on the wet stone below. "My boy loved water," Ruth said quietly. "Always ran toward it. I used to tell him the mountains were no place for pride." A small breath left her. Then one day pride was not the problem. Ice was. Bad timing was. A loose step was. She looked away. "After that, I stopped believing nature was cruel. Cruelty requires intention. The mountain just is." Alara understood, too well. "And people?" Ruth's jaw tightened. "People have no such excuse." Bishop broke the silence by pushing his nose into a patch of grass near the old anchor point. He pawed once, gently. Alara knelt and found a mud-stained compass with a cracked leather cord. Connor's father's compass. The glass was scratched, the brass dulled by years of use, but the needle still trembled toward north. Elara held it carefully, feeling the strange weight of it. A man who knew how to navigate had still needed to be found. There was no shame in that. Perhaps that was the lesson every canyon kept trying to teach. Near the compass, tucked under a flat stone, they found the final piece, a small radio transmitter, still warm from recent use, its tiny light blinking at slow intervals. It had been broadcasting position data from the hidden trail. Someone had known when they reached Old Fern Cut. Someone had watched them prove what was supposed to remain buried. By the time they returned to the vehicles, the sun had climbed high enough to brighten the windshield glass. That was why the damage was so easy to see. One tire on Ruth's command truck had been deliberately emptied. Not slashed open, not dramatic, just carefully deflated. A clean white note was tucked beneath the wiper. Ruth pulled it free and read aloud. Some trails stay buried for a reason. For a moment, no one spoke. The canyon wind moved through the pines with a sound almost like distant breathing. Ruth folded the note once, then handed it to Elara. "This is not trail vandalism anymore," Ruth said, her old voice low and steady. "Someone is willing to put people in danger to keep a secret." Elara looked down at Bishop. The German shepherd stood facing the hidden trail, ears forward, body still as stone. He already knew. Perhaps he had known from the first wrong breath of wind. And now, so did they. Is less than break time equals 0.5 s. Is greater than. The county meeting room in Silver Pine was too bright for the hour, lit by rows of white ceiling panels that made every face look a little tired and every secret look like it had wandered into the wrong place. Outside, late afternoon softened over the North Cascades. McCoy Canyon lay several miles beyond town, hidden behind ridges of pine and stone, but Elara Quinn could feel it in the room as surely as if the waterfall had been pouring down the center aisle. The canyon had become more than a place on a map. It had become a question no one could ignore. Folding chairs filled quickly. Rescue volunteers sat beside hikers, ranchers, shopkeepers, and retirees in rain jackets. Margaret Ellis and Linda Carver sat together near the front. Margaret looked smaller than she had in the canyon, wrapped in a soft gray cardigan, her white curls brushed neatly, but her hands folded with the fragile care of someone who still felt the ledge beneath her feet. Linda wore a dark red sweater and kept one protective hand over her sister's wrist, practical even in fear. Ruth Calloway stood near the wall with her arms crossed, silver hair combed back, her small frame straight as a post. She had not come to perform grief or anger. Ruth had come to place facts where people could not step around them. Marin Holt sat behind Elara, holding a folder of printed reports so tightly the paper edges bent. The young ranger's face was pale, but her eyes no longer darted toward every exit. Fear was still there. It had simply been given a job. Eli Brooks sat beside his mother, clutching the cardboard tube that held his hand-drawn map. He wore a green plaid shirt buttoned wrong at the collar and round glasses that slid down his nose every few minutes. At 12, he was trying very hard to look like someone who belonged in a room full of adults, and almost succeeding. Bishop sat at Elara's left knee. The 5-year, old German shepherd was still as a carved animal from some old northern legend, sable coat clean, ears forward, amber eyes watching the aisle. People gave him space without needing to be told. Bishop had that effect. He did not demand respect. He simply seemed to have been born carrying it. Victor Sloan arrived 3 minutes before the meeting began. He wore a light charcoal suit beneath a dark overcoat, his dark hair brushed back with silver at the temples, his expression composed and gently concerned. He moved through the room slowly, pausing to greet people by name, touching shoulders, lowering his voice as if every sentence were meant to comfort. He was handsome in the polished way of expensive watches and clean windows. His pale eyes never stayed anywhere long enough to be called rude. They assessed, measured, and moved on. Beside him walked a Northline Terrain Services representative Elara had not seen before. The man was in his early 40s, thick-necked and broad through the chest, with close-cut black hair, a square jaw, and a trimmed mustache that made his mouth look sterner than his words. His name badge read Graham Pike. He carried a hard leather case in one hand. Unlike Victor, Graham did not seem elegant. He seemed useful, the sort of man hired to make uncomfortable things appear routine. Victor took the podium when called and smiled at the council, then at the room. "McCoy Canyon is beloved," he began, his voice warm and balanced. "No one here wants to take that away. We want to preserve it, protect it, and ensure that what happened to Mrs. Ellis and Mrs. Carver never happens again." His language moved like soft water. Conservation, safety, sustainable access, emergency modernization, community partnership. He spoke of the rescue as proof that the current system was stretched too thin, that volunteers deserved better tools, that families deserved safer trails. He did not sound like a man taking something. He sounded like a man offering a bridge over fear. Elara watched the room lean toward him. That was his gift. He did not push people. He invited them to step where he had already laid the floor. Then, Ruth Calloway walked to the microphone. She did not adjust it. She simply leaned close enough to be heard. "Last night," she said, "my team located 2 women on a ledge near the lower falls. We used certified rope systems, proper anchors, and trained personnel. They came home because volunteers did the work, not because a private initiative saved them." The room grew quieter. Ruth's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "We are underfunded." That is true, but underfunding is not the same as incompetence, and nobody should be allowed to confuse the two for profit. A chair leg scraped sharply against the floor, loud as a struck match in the bright room. Margaret flinched, and Bishop's head turned at once, not toward the sound, but toward the side aisle where Graham Pike had tightened his grip on the leather case. For one suspended second, no one moved, and the room seemed to hear its own heartbeat. Margaret stood next. Linda rose with her, but did not speak. Margaret's voice trembled at first, then steadied with the strange courage of a woman who had spent a cold night learning which things mattered. "My sister and I did not cross a barrier. We did not ignore a closed trail. We followed a sign." She looked at Victor, not angrily, but with sorrow. "If that sign was wrong, then our mistake was trusting what someone left for us." Marin followed with the reports. Her hands shook only when she began. Then the data seemed to carry her. She showed 8 months of incidents, delayed maintenance requests, missing signs, altered digital maps, removed hazard notes, and the disappearance of Old Fern Cut from the active rescue system. She did not accuse Victor directly. She did something more dangerous. She made the pattern visible. Eli Brooks unrolled his map with help from his mother. A few people smiled kindly at first, the way adults smile when children bring paper into serious rooms. The smiles faded when Elara placed the archived ranger scan beside it. The boy's colored pencil line matched the old emergency route almost exactly. Eli pushed his glasses up and said, "My grandpa said Old Fern Cut was not for tourists. It was for bringing people home." On the screen, Connor Vale appeared from his hospital bed. His face was pale, his beard rougher than before, his shoulder propped against white pillows. He looked tired enough to sleep through a thunderstorm, but his eyes were clear. "I was returning to the main route when I found a low wire across the slope," he said. "I avoided it, lost footing, and fell into the side cut. Before that, I intercepted a private radio transmission. Let them find the women. Not the old route." He paused, breathing carefully. "I also recovered the trail camera, now in evidence." Elara stepped forward last. She did not turn the room into a trial. She knew better. A meeting could expose a pattern, but it could not replace due process. She laid out the chain. Northline equipment in a hidden box near Old Fern Cut. The altered trail reports. The drone tracking the survey team. The red clay on Alan Pierce's shoes. The threatening note. And the safety initiative that would benefit from public fear. Victor's smile remained, but something behind it cooled. Then Bishop rose. The movement was silent, but everyone near Elara felt it. The German shepherd walked 2 steps toward Graham Pike and stopped. His nose lowered toward the leather case. A low growl moved through him, not wild, not theatrical, but certain. Graham's face tightened. "Is this necessary?" he asked. Alara looked at the county sheriff standing near the door. Sheriff Daniel Rowe was a tall man in his 50s, with weathered brown skin, silver-black hair, cropped short, and tired eyes that suggested he had spent too many years choosing caution over comfort. He had stayed quiet until now, but not absent. Alara said, "Sheriff, based on the unauthorized equipment found this morning, the witness intimidation note, and the connection to Northline materials, that case should be preserved as potential evidence." Sheriff Rowe stepped forward. "Mr. Pike, set the case on the table." Graham looked at Victor. It was quick. Too quick for most people, but not for Alara. Victor did not nod. He did not speak. He simply stopped smiling with his eyes. The case was opened by the sheriff, not Alara. Inside were folders, a tablet, and a printed communications plan. One page was marked for internal use. It referred to the next significant rescue failure as an opportunity to advance emergency privatized access before opposition groups could regroup. It recommended emphasizing fear, delays, volunteer limitations, and public memory while still emotionally active. No one shouted. That was the strange part. The room became so quiet that the hum of the ceiling lights sounded enormous. Victor finally stood. "Preliminary communications language is not evidence of wrongdoing." "No," Alara said. "Not by itself." Ruth looked at him. "But it is enough to stop pretending this vote is clean." The council chair, a weary woman named Helen Marsh with white blonde hair and a careful, civic face, called for an emergency suspension of the vote pending independent review. Hands rose slowly, then firmly. The McCoy Canyon Safety Renewal Initiative was tabled. Northline's current contracts were frozen. An outside investigation was requested. Victor gathered his coat with controlled grace. Only once did the mask slip. His smile stayed, but his eyes lost their calm, turning sharp and bare for less than a second before he lowered them. Alara saw it. Bishop saw it too. As people began to speak in low, shaken voices, Bishop returned to Alara's side and stood beneath the two bright lights of the room. Outside the tall windows, the distant ridges darkened toward evening. Somewhere beyond them, McCoy Canyon waited, silent and ancient, like a witness that had finally heard its name spoken aloud. The battle was not over, but the silence had broken. Is less than break time equals 0. 5S is greater than. The days after the meeting did not bring the thunderclap ending. People sometimes imagine when truth finally enters a room. Victor Sloan did not vanish in chains by sunrise. Northline Terrain Services did not confess beneath the weight of one hard stare. Silverpine did not wake the next morning pure and healed, with every crooked paper suddenly straightened by grace. Real justice moved more slowly than that. It came with subpoenas, sealed evidence bags, county auditors, federal interviews, tired deputies, and coffee gone cold in rooms where decent people had to say again and again what they knew and when they knew it. Alara Quinn understood that kind of justice. It was not grand, it was patient. It built a staircase, one verified fact at a time. The investigation widened through layers that had been designed to look harmless. Northline Terrain Services had handled trail updates, equipment storage, and contract inspections. A forest safety consulting group had written language about unmanageable public risk. A rescue support foundation tied to Victor's donors had supplied drones, rope, software, and private radio equipment. A few county officials had not taken money directly, but they had accepted favors, campaign help, discounted consulting, and the comfortable little kindnesses that make a conscience sleepy. No document said, "Put people in danger." That was the ugly genius of it. The papers only said, "Delay review, revise access status, remove inactive route, redirect maintenance priority." Yet the result had been clear enough. Signs turned. Old fern cut buried. Teams watched. Public fear guided like water into Victor's waiting mill. No one proved that Victor had intended for Margaret Ellis, Linda Carver, or Connor Vale to suffer. Alara was careful with that, because truth had to be strong enough to survive courtrooms, not just angry conversations. But investigators did prove something quieter and nearly as damning. Victor's network had knowingly created unsafe conditions, concealed safer rescue access, and prepared to use the next serious incident as leverage for private control of McCoy Canyon. That was enough to freeze the initiative. Then enough to suspend Northline's contracts. Then enough to open conflict of interest inquiries that moved from Silver Pine into the county seat and beyond. McCoy Canyon did not close forever. That mattered to Ruth Calloway more than most people understood. A place should not be punished because people had lied about it. By early summer, crews returned under public oversight. New signs went up at every fork, plain, visible, and checked by 2 independent teams. Old Fern Cut was restored as a trained rescue access route, not a tourist shortcut. The digital maps were audited line by line. Trail updates became public record, searchable even by retired schoolteachers with too much time and excellent suspicion. Ruth called that democracy with reading glasses. Silver Pine Search and Rescue received new funding, this time through a transparent county grant, with equipment reviewed by people who knew the difference between generosity and a leash. In the team room, Ruth hung an old navy blue knit cap inside a small glass case above the equipment bench. It had belonged to her son. For years, she had kept it hidden in a drawer, folded around grief like a secret. Now it sat beside a handwritten note. For every lost soul we still have time to find. Ruth never made a speech about it. She simply touched the glass once on the morning it was hung, then told everyone to stop staring and clean the mud off the rope bags. The first new trail sign went into the earth with one clean strike of a hammer, and the sound rang across the canyon like a bell. Margaret Ellis closed her eyes at that sound. For a breath, the whole crowd went still, not from fear this time, but from the strange, tender shock of hearing a place begin again. Margaret and Linda had returned for the reopening ceremony, wearing sensible boots and matching windbreakers, though Linda had insisted on carrying enough snacks for a small church picnic. Margaret placed a small bouquet of white wildflowers near the trailhead, not as a farewell, but as thanks. Her white curls moved in the morning breeze, and when she looked toward the falls, her face held sorrow and gratitude in the same gentle hand. "My husband wanted me to see this place," she told Alara. "I think I finally did. Not just the pretty part, the true part." Marin Holt did not resign. She came close. Twice. But each time, Alara's words returned to her. A mistake was not the end of her story unless she let it be. Marin became the district's records and map integrity coordinator, a title so dry that Eli Brooks said it sounded like something invented to frighten children into doing homework. Marin laughed when he said it, which was how everyone knew she was healing. She kept Eli's colored pencil map framed beside the official McCoy Canyon access chart. The boy received the first public print of the corrected map, with Old Fern Cut marked in a fine green line. Eli held it like a royal decree and announced that his grandfather would have said, "Told you so," but louder. Connor Vale recovered slowly, which annoyed him more than the injury itself. The rattlesnake bite and fall left him weaker than he wanted to admit, and for several weeks he moved with a cane and the stiff patience of a man negotiating with his own pride. He stayed in Silver Pine, first because doctors ordered rest, then because Ruth discovered he could teach rope fundamentals without making volunteers feel foolish. He trained the SAR team on navigation, field stabilization, and the sacred art of not walking alone into suspicious brush after dark. Ruth listened to that last lesson with one eyebrow raised. Connor accepted the punishment of her silence with dignity. Alara stayed longer than planned. At first, it was paperwork, then follow-up interviews, then an advisory role with the Public Land Safety Task Force. Then, somehow, mornings with Bishop along the ridge and coffee outside Brooks Outfitters while Connor pretended not to limp and Alara pretended not to notice. Nothing between them was rushed. They were both people who had survived too much noise to trust sudden declarations. What grew between them came quietly. A shared look when Bishop sighed at them like an elderly judge, a joke about Connor's cane, a silence that no longer felt empty. Bishop became Silver Pine's unofficial guardian. Children waved at him. Rescue volunteers saluted him with sandwiches they were not allowed to give him. A short trail near the restored access point gained a wooden sign, "Bishop's Trail for those who listen before it is too late." Bishop inspected the sign once, sneezed, and walked away, unimpressed by fame. Ilara took that as approval. Months later, under a bright blue morning, Ilara, Connor, and Bishop walked the repaired path above McCoy Falls. Connor still carried a cane, though he used it more for argument than necessity. "Your dog is watching my foot placement again," he said. Ilara looked down at Bishop, who had paused to stare at Connor's boots with deep professional disappointment. "He has high standards. He has impossible standards. He found you under a cedar root. He earned them." Connor smiled, and this time there was no shadow behind it. Bishop trotted ahead, stopped beside the safe edge of the trail, and turned back. Below them, McCoy Falls shone in the sun, bright as poured silver. Ilara felt something inside her loosen, something that had been tied tight since long before Silverpeen. The canyon had not taken them. It had returned them to the path, to the truth, and perhaps gently to one another. Is less than break time equals 0. 5S is greater than. The message of this story is simple, but it reaches deep. Sometimes the path we think is lost is only waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. McCoy Canyon was never the enemy. The forest was not cruel. The water, the stone, the wind, and the old trees were only witnesses. The real danger came from human pride, silence, and the temptation to turn fear into power. But where there was fear, there was also courage. Where there was darkness, there was still a way home. Ilara, Connor, Ruth, Marin, Margaret, Linda, Eli, and Bishop each carried something heavy. Some carried guilt, some carried grief, some carried fear. Some carried wounds no one could see. Yet each of them learned that healing begins when one person chooses to tell the truth, when one hand reaches for another, and when one faithful animal listens to what the human heart has missed. Bishop reminds us that animals are not just companions. They are gifts of loyalty, instinct, and quiet grace. A dog may not speak in our language, but sometimes God lets love speak through a wagging tail, a watchful eye, or a brave heart that refuses to leave someone behind. To care for animals is not a small act. It is a sign that our hearts have not grown cold. When we protect the gentle creatures around us, we also protect the best part of ourselves. In everyday life, we may not face a hidden trail or a dangerous canyon, but we all meet moments when someone needs help. It may be a neighbor who feels forgotten, an elderly person walking alone, a frightened animal on the roadside, or a friend who says they are fine when their eyes say otherwise. The lesson is this: do not walk past suffering just because it is quiet. Do not ignore the small signs. Sometimes a miracle begins with noticing, and perhaps that is where God's hand can be seen most clearly. Not always in thunder or lightning, but in timing. In a dog turning toward the right trail. In a rescuer arriving before hope fades. In a stranger becoming family. In a heart that learns to trust again. What some call coincidence may be a whisper of grace, reminding us that heaven has not forgotten the lost. So, live gently, speak truthfully, help when you can, love your family while they are still beside you, care for animals with kindness, and when life feels like a dark canyon, remember that God can still place a faithful guide on your path. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or share a moment when an animal changed your life. And if you believe stories like this can remind the world to be kinder, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, protect your family, guide your steps, and keep your heart open to the quiet miracles He places along the way.